kind of ambitiously called this Yes Equality, and Susie mentioned earlier as well, we need our Yes Equality moment in disability. So, and I think we've talked about relationships, so I've called the presentation Disability and the Right to Love. I'll be talking a little bit about consent to sex, but also a bit about marriage, because those topics are both what we're talking about today. So at the beginning I want to describe that what we had in law up until this year, in the criminal law on consent to sex, and what the problems with it were, which lots of people in this room probably already know a lot about. And then I'll compare that with the international human rights standards. Some people here maybe were involved in an effort that I took part in as well, when she was at the time Senator, Catherine Zappone, of course she's now a Minister, put together a private members bill to try to change the law on the right to relationships for people with disabilities. So I want to talk a little bit about that and what happened. And then this year we did have a legal change, so I want to describe that law and see how we can use it positively, but also some of the challenges that I think we still have in that law. Finally, say something about the right to marry. Okay, so this is the old law up on the slide, and I'm not going to read it all out because it's written in very technical legal language, but a lot of people in the room who work in the field probably remember hearing a lot about Section 5. Section 5 of the 1993 Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act was, up until March this year, the law regarding consent to sex and people with disabilities. And we heard earlier from the floor as well that it only applied to sexual intercourse, so penetrative sex. It didn't apply to any other acts, any other sexual acts. And what the law used to say is that a person who has what they called a mental impairment is guilty of a crime if they have sexual intercourse, if someone has sexual intercourse with them. The person who has sexual intercourse with the person with a disability is the one who is guilty of a crime. And interestingly, it said that if you were married to the person, it was not an offence. And we changed the law a long time, well not that long ago, but we have changed the law about rape within marriage in Ireland. So it used to be that if you were married, it was not possible for you to be raped by your husband, because that's the way the law was written. And we now acknowledge that just because you're married doesn't mean you have always agreed to have sex with this person. Strangely, we didn't make that change with regard to people with disabilities. So we said if they were married, it was fine. It wasn't a crime. So the only other way to show that it was not a crime if a person had sex with a person with a mental impairment, I'll explain what mental impairment was in a minute, was that to show that the person had no idea that this person had a disability. Okay, so they didn't realise, and that was also a defence. But also interestingly, the fact that the person agreed, no matter how enthusiastically, was not a defence. So consent was not a defence to this crime. It didn't matter if two people were having consensual sex, if at least one of them had a mental impairment, it was considered that it was a crime unless they were married, or unless it could be proven that the person having sex with them didn't know they had a disability. This is pretty bad. And everyone knew it was pretty bad and we wanted it to be changed. So before I go on to what we changed it to and why it needed to be changed, I just want to explain what mental impairment meant in the old law. So it said mental impairment was suffering from a disorder of the mind, whether through mental handicap or mental illness, which is of such a nature or degree as to render a person incapable of living an independent life or of guarding against serious exploitation. So you had to have the diagnosis or the label of intellectual disability or mental health, but that just because you had a disability wasn't enough. You had to show that the person, because of their disability, was not able to live independently, or they were not able to protect themselves against exploitation. And when we talk about discrimination and double standards, I think this is a really good example of that, because the rest of the law for everybody else says that, I think I'm right, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but 17 is the age of consent in Ireland?
18.
No, it's 17 actually.
17,
am I right? Yeah. 18 for marriage though. So, 17 for sex. And how many 17-year-olds would pass that test of being capable of living an independent life or of guarding themselves against serious exploitation? I'm not sure. I think we might find quite a few who didn't pass that test. Exactly. How many adults would pass that test? So here we have a clear example of discrimination where people with disabilities are asked to reach a higher standard in order to be able to have consensual sex that isn't risking bringing them within criminal prosecution than the rest of us. Okay, so here are the problems. It's what we call a strict liability offence. And what that means is that consent is not a defence. It doesn't matter if the person consented. And the only other area of criminal law, well, the main other area of criminal law where you see things like strict liability is in relation to children. Okay, so it doesn't matter if the child consented. They're a child, they can't consent, so therefore it's a criminal act. So again, we're seeing adults with disabilities being equated with children, and that's a problem. It's a higher standard than the general population. And there were also problems in even prosecuting it. So there were very few cases taken under Section 5 where people were actually found guilty. And in one case taken under Section 5, the woman who was raped said that she wanted to give evidence by video link. And this is something that we allow for what we call vulnerable witnesses. But the judge said he couldn't allow her to give evidence by video link because the test for becoming a vulnerable witness is very similar to this test for mental impairment on Section 5. And because in Section 5 it doesn't matter if you consented, it only matters if you have the disability and sex happened, he wouldn't allow her to give video evidence because he was afraid it would prove the prosecution's point that she had a mental impairment. And of course the defendant was arguing he didn't know she had a mental impairment. So, even this law that was supposed to make it easier to find people guilty of sexually exploiting people with disabilities didn't actually work like that. So it's both discriminatory and it didn't actually protect them. So back to human rights law, let's broaden it out again. We've already heard about this from Sarah this morning, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and we've already heard from the audience as well how Ireland still hasn't ratified.
The sooner the better.
The sooner the better is right. So Article 12, as you've heard from Sarah, is about the right to enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others, and it covers all aspects of life. So of course that includes sex and relationships. States are required to take measures to provide support to persons with disabilities that they might require in exercising and using their rights. And that would include support in terms of sexual education or support in terms of finding out about marriage. And of course we also need to have safeguards. So we talked about empowering people but also having protection or having safeguards. But what's really important about Article 12 and safeguards is that it says having this idea of the best interest or for the person's own good or any of that, that's not actually a safeguard. The only thing that actually protects people is when we respect their rights, will and preferences. Okay? So it's not a safeguard to take away your freedom to keep you safe. We know that doesn't keep people safe. What keeps people safe is information and support to be able to speak out when something is happening that they're not comfortable with. There are other parts of the convention that are relevant as well. So for example, Article 16 talks about protecting people from violence, exploitation and abuse. And that's very important because we know that disabled people do experience violence, exploitation and abuse. And we have to provide good support for people who have had that experience, including their recovery, reintegration into society and so on. And Article 23, which Sarah also talked about, is about eliminating discrimination in relation to everything about marriage, family, parenthood and relationships. So including the right to marry, people are of the marriageable age, whatever that is, and in Ireland it's 18. They have the right to marry and to found a family on the basis of free and full consent. Okay, so we'll come back to how do we know people are really giving consent. Final thing I want to say, which again was mentioned by Sarah, is about the general comment on Article 12. And the general comment is something that the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities have created as a sort of form of guidance to countries when they're looking at how to interpret the Convention and how to interpret Article 12. So we need to be clear about the difference between legal capacity and mental capacity. And I know Sarah said this, but I think it can't be said often enough. So everybody has legal capacity by virtue of being human, and sometimes our laws try to restrict people's legal capacity because of what we think about their mental capacity or their ability to make decisions or to understand things. But we know that mental capacity is different for every person, and we all have different decision-making skills depending on lots of things, including what education we've had, what information we're given, what time of day it is, whether I've had a cup of coffee, all of those things. So it's really clear that We might have different levels of understanding about things, but that's not a reason to deny us our legal rights, and that includes the right to consent to sex and the right to marry. Okay, so we all knew Section 5 was terrible, the old law on consent to sex. People were very worried about it. And there were, as we heard this morning, many attempts to change this over the years. And the one that I want to talk about before looking at what the law actually changed to is the one that Catherine Zappone worked on. And some people in this room were part of that process as well. So, in discussing with Catherine Zappone why the law needed to change, I think one of the things that she said initially was that she was drawn to this after actually having seen the documentary Somebody to Love, which featured clips from the play Sanctuary. And as someone who she felt the state hadn't recognised her relationship, and she wanted to support other people who wanted their relationships to be recognised. So we talked about what could we have instead of Section 5. So we already have the law of rape, we already have the law of sexual offences that applies to everybody, and we've heard very strongly that disabled people don't want a separate law for them. They want the same rights and chances as everybody else. They want the same law to apply to them as everyone else. But if we're worried about exploitation and abuse, what would be a good law for everyone who might be vulnerable to abuse or exploitation that we could introduce? So we talked about people who are in a position of power, or people who are in a position of authority over a person, or someone who you would trust, who then abuses that trust to sexually exploit you. That's really bad, and that can happen to lots of people, not just disabled people. So that could happen to someone who is a survivor of human trafficking. It could happen to someone who is an asylum seeker living in direct provision. There are lots of people who might be in marginalised positions who have people in power over them who use that power to sexually exploit them. So we wanted to create what we call a disability neutral law that would apply to everyone, not just people with disabilities. And we also wanted to make sure that consent was a defence, because this is one of the problems with Section 5. It doesn't recognise that people can actually give consent. So, and the other problem with Section 5, as we talked about, is that it only applied to sexual intercourse, so only penetrative sex. There are lots of other ways that people can be exploited that don't look like penetration, so we need to make sure that whatever law we have covers all sexual acts. So that was what Catherine did in her bill, and she also worked with people to hear their experiences and try to reflect that as we were making the bill. We included a definition of consent, which isn't a million miles away from what we now have, as Sinead told you this morning, in the 2017 Act that applies to all rape and sexual offences law. And we wanted to make sure that in any sexual offences law there is no denial of legal capacity based on the functional test, because we think testing people's mental capacity to consent to sex is a discriminatory thing that really does only happen to disabled people, and it's something that isn't actually helpful and it needs to stop. And of course, as we were discussing this with people who have lived under the law, everyone talked about education and how important it was to have the right information, and how just fixing the criminal law wouldn't really do it for people in their lives, because they needed to make sure that things changed on the ground, and education was the way to do that. So Catherine introduced what's called a private members bill. And the process with private members bill is that they never really become law, or very rarely become law. So we knew it wasn't ever really going to pass, but what we hoped was that by putting it out there and making people aware of it, that the Department of Justice, when they came to change the law, which they had been saying they were going to do for ages, they would look at this and use it as an example. They sort of did, but not really the way we wanted. So here's what we've got. The 2017 Act. This is in force. Section 5 is gone now. Okay? So it's been repealed, it's been replaced with these two new offences in the 2017 Act. So we've got an offence of engaging in a sexual act with a protected person. So this is all sexual acts. The law doesn't just talk about sexual intercourse with people with disabilities anymore. It's about everything. Any act that done without consent would constitute a sexual assault, up to and including penetration and rape. It covers all defendants, so it doesn't matter whether the person who is accused of this crime has a disability or not. Okay? So it doesn't matter if it's two disabled people who had sex, and now someone is saying that that person committed a crime, or whether it's a non-disabled person and a disabled person. But the victim has to be a person with a disability. Okay? And there's a strange thing, this is kind of technical, maybe 2 law, and you can ask me more about it if I'm not clear. But the way they describe how the crime is being committed is they say that the person doing the crime, so the offender, must know that it's a protected person, i.e. a person with a disability, or they're reckless as to whether or not it was a protected person that they had sex with. And usually it's up to the state in court to prove that the person, the offender or the defendant, to prove what they knew. And the defendant doesn't have to prove anything, they just sit there and wait for the state to prove the case against them. But interestingly, they kind of change that in this. So they say, we will assume that the person knew that they were having sex with a protected person. And it's up to them to prove to us that they didn't know that the person had a disability. And that would be a defence if you didn't know the person had a disability. But you have to prove it, which is different from how the law normally works. So that's the sexual act of the protected person, and I'll give you the definitions of protected person in a minute. The other offence, which only again applies to disabled people, is the offence against a relevant person by a person in authority. And this is why I said they kind of heard what Catherine Zappone was saying, but not really. Because she was talking about people who were sexually exploited by people in power or people in a position of authority, but she didn't want it to just apply to disabled people. And what they've done here is they've taken abuse of power or authority, but only applied it to disabled people. Again, it applies to all sexual acts, and consent is not a defence. A person in authority is quite narrowly defined. I mean, it really is talking about a staff member in a particular setting or service who has sex with a person with a disability. But strangely, they put in this thing called the reasonable mistake defence. So if the staff member can prove that they were reasonably mistaken, they didn't realise this was a person with a disability, how is this going to work? Because they're a staff member hired to provide a service to people with disability, so no one is ever going to really be able to prove reasonable mistake. No jury is ever going to believe a person that they were mistaken as to whether or not the person had a disability. So I'm not really sure why it's there.
That's going to be very...
So I keep saying person with a disability, but that's not strictly the definition. So the protected person they used for the first crime, and here's the definition. It's a mental or intellectual disability or a mental illness, and the person is incapable of understanding the nature or the reasonably foreseeable consequences of the act, evaluating relevant information for the purpose of deciding whether or not to engage in the act, or communicating his or her consent to that act by speech, sign language, or otherwise. Okay, so it's not just that you have a disability. Having a disability doesn't mean that you shouldn't have sex. It's only if your disability is such that you wouldn't understand sex, or the consequences of sex, or that you can't make up your mind about sex because of your disability, or you can't communicate whether or not you want to have sex to another person. So this is basically a functional test of mental capacity applied to sex. But again, this gets no one else outside of a person with a mental or intellectual disability or mental illness is asked to do this. Okay? So again, if we ask other adults, or 17-year-olds indeed, what do they understand about the reasonably foreseeable consequences of sex? How much knowledge do they have about pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases or anything else? It's still holding people to a higher standard, and it's very similar to the language that was used in section 5 in my view, so it's not really moving on very much. They've just used this nice cover called protected person, and originally actually wanted to use vulnerable person, and then they were told vulnerable was bad, so they used protected instead, but the words are still the same, the definition is still the same, they're just moving things around. Okay, so I talked about how they reverse the burden of proof, so it will be presumed until the contrary is shown that the defendant or was reckless as to whether the person was a protected person. So we're expecting people to know that this person has not just a disability, but a disability that would affect their giving of consent. It's up to you then to prove that you didn't know, or that to prove that the person was able to give consent. So that's for the first one, and then for the one that the offence of the person in authority, so what I call the kind of staff-like offence. They don't use protected person, they use relevant person, just to confuse things even more. And it has a slightly different definition, which is again very similar to section 5. It's a person with a mental or intellectual disability or a mental illness, which severely restricts the ability of the person to guard himself or herself against serious exploitation. So all that's changed is that they've just taken out that bit about incapable of living an independent life. And they've kept the stuff about serious exploitation, and they've kept the labels of intellectual disability or mental illness. So who is a person in authority? A person in authority is any person who, as part of a contract for service, is for the time being responsible for the education, supervision, training, treatment, care or welfare of the relevant person. So I call that staff for short. It covers a wide range of things. And it's not specific to staff in disability services. So it could be, it could be a teacher, it could be anyone else who, if someone is in a mainstream education setting, for example. And this is the bit that makes me slightly nervous. So both offences, both the protected person and the relevant person one, have this line in them about a person who invites, induces, counsels or incites a person to engage in a sexual act. And I think this is where people might get nervous about providing sex education, for example, because they might say, oh, but if we give the person the information and then they go and have sex, are we responsible, or what if it's a crime and what are we supposed to do? So I want to be clear that I don't imagine in my wildest dreams that the Director of Public Prosecutions would go around prosecuting staff for providing education to people about sex. I don't think that what we're talking about would fall within this definition of someone who is inviting, inducing, counselling or inciting a person to have sex or to engage in a sexual act. I think it's designed to, so if a person is, again, exploiting someone, but they're not the one having sex with them, they exploit them to have sex with another person, then that person is also guilty. I think that's what they're trying to do there. So I don't want people to read this and come away thinking we're not allowed to give people information about sex, because that's not what it's about. So this is our definition of consent. This is the long version. Sinead gave you this morning the first part: freely and voluntarily agrees to engage in the act. But then there's a long definition of things that are not consent, which I think is important to remember as well. And this does apply to everyone. So this isn't just for disabled people, this is for everybody. So we now have written down in the law that a person does not consent if they allow the sexual act to happen because of force, or because of threat of force, or because of a fear that force might happen to either themselves or someone else. If the person is asleep or unconscious, we saw that in the cup of tea video, alright, then they're not consenting. If someone is unable to consent because of drink or drugs, and then there's this bit which I'm not mad about, but anyway, we'll come back to it. If the person is suffering from a physical disability which prevents him or her from communicating whether he or she agrees to the act, I don't see why A, suffering, and B, physical disability needs to be there. If the person is prevented from communicating whether they agree to sex, then I think that should apply as a part of the definition of when someone is not consenting. If the person is mistaken as to the nature and purpose of the act, so if the person thinks that they're agreeing to something else, but actually sex is what happens. Or if they're mistaken as to the identity of the person involved in the act, so they think they're having sex with person A, but actually it's person B, and they haven't really given their consent. If the person is locked up at the time that the act takes place, they're not consenting. If it's someone else who says, oh yeah, she agrees to have sex with you, then that's not consent. So it's good to have all this written down, I think, because it makes it clearer, and hopefully when cases are coming to the courts and juries are being asked to decide whether someone gave consent or not, to decide whether a rape happened, they'll be able to look at this list and see if any of those things were present and say, oh well, she was unconscious, so we've got that written down as one of the things that need no consent. Okay. Right, so that's consent to sex. So while I am disappointed at what happened in the 2017 Act, and I don't think it's what disabled people asked for, I don't think people were listened to when they clearly said over and over, we don't want a special law for people with disabilities, we just want the general law to apply to us. And that didn't work, and I don't really still understand why that didn't work, except I think people are risk averse, as we've heard, they're afraid, and they feel like disabled people just need to be protected. And if we're getting rid of Section 5, we've got to put in something that looks very like Section 5. We're actually two things now, so we only had to do with Section 5 before, now we have problems. So it still would need to be changed in my view. However, I would say that in order to support and empower people to have consensual sex, we should be telling people that if you have the information, if you can understand sex, if you can communicate your agreement to sex, then you are lawfully having sex, and there is no reason why you should be criminally prosecuted. Okay, so I think that's an important message to give, and to support people to reach that level of understanding and being able to communicate their agreement. That's what we should be doing, while acknowledging it's still not what we would ideally like. So we heard this morning that unfortunately we're still operating under the Marriage of Lunatics Act 1811 in Ireland. And what that says is if persons found lunatic marry before declared sane by the Lord Chancellor, such marriages shall be declared void. We don't have a Lord Chancellor anymore.
Only in the UK.
Yeah, so this was when Ireland was part of the UK. But we still somehow have this provision. And we're not even really sure what the definition of lunatic is, because it doesn't say in the one line 1811 Act what they think a lunatic is. But that language was also used in our ward of court legislation. And in the ward of court legislation, a lunatic is a person who is, they call, of unsound mind, who is unable to govern themselves or their property. So maybe that's the definition of lunatic, but the property stuff doesn't make that much sense, maybe in the context of marriage, although maybe it does. The Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act has a bit in it that says the Marriage of Lunatics Act is repealed. But of course, that part of the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act has not been commenced. So we still have the Marriage of Lunatics Act 1811 until that happens. And so our laws on marriage still refer to this Marriage of Lunatics Act, and we heard from Sarah this morning about how that applies. So what would happen is two people show up to the registry office to give their intention, to notify their intention to marry, which you have to do 3 months before the marriage takes place, and you sign a form declaring that there is no impediment, and marriage of lunatics is an impediment. If someone wants to object to your marriage, so we've all seen in the movies that I object, so if that happens, they have to have a certificate of a registered medical practitioner that supports the objection and says, yes, this would be a marriage of lunatics. And so if nobody objects, let's say you've got really supportive family and everyone is really happy that you're getting married, off you go, and then when you show up to get married, the priest or the registrar or whoever's performing the marriage, they have to be satisfied that both parties understand the nature of the marriage ceremony and declarations before they will actually go ahead and do the marriage ceremony. So if your family are happy and nobody objects, and you go through the notification process and you get to the wedding and the priest or the registrar or whoever is happy and marries you, that's it. You're married, you're legally married, and no one can take that away from you. I'm pretty sure that if neither party is a ward of court, there is no legal impediment, because I think that's probably the definition of lunatic they're using. But as you saw from Sarah, there's lots of contradictory guidance out there, including from the Department of Social Protection, that doesn't use lunatic. It uses intellectual disability and mental ill health. So I'm out of time, and I want to just say what should happen in the future. So we need to commence the right provisions of the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act. What will happen under that then is that you'll do the same process, you'll have a notification meeting, people can object, but really it kind of clarifies that the only kind of objection that will be accepted is where to our international visitors, I've kind of translated that as High Registrar for Sarah, but I'm not sure if that's really correct. If they receive a copy of an order from the Circuit Court saying that one or both parties lack capacity, and not just capacity for something else, but capacity to marry, then we must presume that people have capacity and go ahead with the marriage. Although again, as I say, the priest or the person performing the marriage must still be certain when they're doing it that both parties understand, otherwise they won't go ahead with it. That was all I was going to say, so I think we've already started questions.
I just have visions of training of registrars and priests and God forbid the judges, in all interpreting this and their notions, and if what we're seeing from Justice Peter Kelly's courtroom is anything to go by, operation of this part of the law is going to be quite something else. Okay, so with that, opening the floor to questions and comments on the current situation and indeed the future issues that have to be dealt with. We're going to move on now to another one of the most valuable pieces of this entire project, and that is the storytellers. And another storyteller today is Ronnie Harris. Ronnie's from Dublin, and Ronnie is going to speak about his experience, and he's supported by Jana. Jana's from Germany, is doing a PhD in the area. It actually works in supporting people, capacity building around issues to do with legal guardianship, which is actually related to what we've just been talking about. It's very important. So I'm going to hand it over to Ronnie, who's going to talk about his experiences.
Thank you. So I'm going to do a bit of an introduction, as already decided on, but can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I want to say good morning, because we've been spending over a year now Skyping on a regular basis, and even though we had our difficulties first because I couldn't understand Irish, yeah, we've really gotten to know each other, and it's been such a pleasure to do so. And yeah, I'm just really happy that we got matched and that I was able to hear your story, and I want to thank you for your trust telling the story. And I want to thank you for the leprechaun. Ronnie got me yesterday when I was a bit of a nervous wreck. And yeah, we took him with us to bring us some luck from that. Yeah, so we've been Skyping. Hey? Yeah, it's Alfie.
Hey, hello.
Yeah. There's a story behind the name, but we don't have that much time right now. So yeah, we changed our title, as you might have noticed, because Ronnie picked his title, but we were a bit late.
Yeah.
And now it's Dreaming of Traveling, Dreaming of Freedom. That's what we picked.
Yeah.
And I think it might be surprising because it doesn't really have to do with consent to sex or relationship in the first, but in fact it does. It's got to do about traveling with your fiancé. So when we talked, we would write letters. So I would write notes during our Skype days and write letters, and then we would use them to communicate and talk. Yeah. And that's how we got the idea to use letters in the book as well, which will be published next year, I believe. So this is a bit of a secret because it's not out yet, but we took some snippets of it to demonstrate to you what's important and what's the message behind the story. So yeah, we're going to start with a little interview, right? We took Elvis because he's a favorite singer. So let's start with really important stuff. Yes, you are actually. So can you tell us a bit about yourself? Where do you live?
I live in Dunamane, and I have my own partner. I live in partner, Denise, and we go shopping and do our own thing. But what I want now is you should be able to fly, pick her on holidays. We don't. If I'm not in, I don't come there because I might get sick. I know what to do. Just get your car, they'll check you out and come back.
So there we are, right at the biggest issue, right? Because you live together with Denise, which is your fiancée.
Yeah.
And you also would love to travel with her, don't you?
I would. Yeah. I don't like them groups. So we've gone away, say it's a small group, never a big group, but I'd rather go away with Denise, not no groups, just self Denise. I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, we are hoping to bring some change with this project, so you never know, we do hope that.
Please God.
So yeah, but that's basically the main issue, right? Because you want to travel and you want to travel on your own choice, and that's
our choice, no one else's.
Yeah, you want to travel with Denise, your fiancée.
Just down and back and go to the beach and walk around, do shopping.
It's really not that much to ask for, I think so. But you've been traveling overseas before, right?
Well, I went to China.
Because that's we have very sporty storytellers today.
2 gold.
You got 2 gold medals and another medal, didn't you?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, 3. And I also got gold, but that's what I wanted to travel to the wrong thing.
So yeah, you have been traveling overseas and you have a passion for traveling, which is I do. So that was a big similarity between us.
Who went up like this, down the country, and I was saying the same bit at the side of the country, but I don't want to fly away. That's why myself, rather fly. The country's alright, but people down all the time, you get sick of it.
It does get boring.
Level course.
Yeah. So that's what we've been talking about a lot, because I can really get your point to make really good points about what you don't like about group traveling. And it was the whole thing about not having the choice.
Just do.
Where to go, what to do,
Yeah.
what to do.
When to get married, and what you have to do is to say, first get your own place first, that's the first thing to do. Get a good job, a really good job now. Well, the guy has something to do with part-time.
That would be easy,
It's
right?
only voluntary work that's on do. And only the work I do was only 3 days, I waited 3 days to get a job. One was to take hand and get sick, take their place. It takes too long to wait, like you said.
You actually work in 2 jobs.
Two jobs, yeah.
One is volunteer.
Volunteer, that's all. Just clean up and
Is it
Job,
the
yeah.
New Life?
do it, yeah. Clean up everything outside and inside, make sure it's clean and go. And a
And
good
then
job.
that doesn't get paid,
No.
so that doesn't really
Fine.
help you. But then you have another one at the pseudo
Pseudo
cream
cream.
factory.
It's a baler. The boxes go with the boxes. Bags go with the bags. Black bags go with the baler. And it's
That
sweep
does
up.
get paid, right?
That thing.
But it pays little and you never know when to work.
No.
So people tell you you have to save up money to
Yeah.
travel and to get married
Get married,
and
yeah.
to get your, to do what you want in your
I
life, and
want
at the same
good
time.
job, good fun job. That would be me. And I'll be there for she's not working, so I want a good job so I can bring the money in and then take a photograph, come back down here and show you I went this holiday.
So that's a lot of barriers, I think, and it's not only about traveling, but that's one more example of
Yeah.
people making it hard for you
Yeah.
to actually live your life
Yeah.
with your fiancé.
Can't go here, can't there.
But about the traveling again, so it took me quite a while to understand why you actually can't travel.
Just
So,
because my family said we get sick, then we're going to do it. We get sick or gets injured, why you don't do it? They go, get the car, get to the hospital, or we can't go to the hospital, bring a doctor and get checked up, and she's not feeling well, and just bring put inside. I'm staying over here because this is not, she hurt her leg and had to stay over here to make sure she's okay.
yeah, so
Get to the doctor.
they're worried.
That's your fiancé.
So your family is kind of prohibiting you to travel overseas
Yeah.
without a group
Yeah,
because of worry and
yeah.
fear.
So, but,
They've been talking about it with them, right?
well, yeah.
Yeah.
They said, I can't let you go, I just go down to the country. I said, I want to know, it's my life. If I want to be somewhere on this, I'm going on this, and go, no. You know, about my own business, this is my life. I want to treat these the way I want. You have to treat your partner. Don't do what she wants. She wants sex, no. But we don't have sex at all. We just live together. That's us. That's the way you want it. That's what I want as well.
As long as you two.
As long as we're sitting here together.
But Ronnie, the traveling, so you talked about.
Excuse me, the microphone.
So is that better?
It's speaking on my.
Yeah, maybe I can take. Yeah, but it's so hard to get off. Oh, that doesn't really happen. That's better, isn't it? Yeah. So yeah, with the traveling, because I remember we talked about it, and you were really okay. That switched it up. You were really worried that traveling without Denise is making things hard for you in your relationship. Like imagine never travel with your partner. So.
I was at home by myself. She's on holidays, so she becomes the same time I go, what?
Yeah, so that's also a major reason why you really want to change things and why we're really here today. Because what was your idea to begin this project? Was it?
I just want to tell everybody that let anybody from same way as if they want to move in together, let them. That's their choice, no less a choice. They want to move together, they want to get married, that's their choice. Don't say, oh, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. So, look, one choice. Either you fake off or you go here, or don't come back here again. That's the end.
And if you want to travel with your fiancé, that's your choice too. So.
Everybody's choice, not just my choice. It's everybody, all this, what you know, they want to travel anywhere. We're all the same as you, do the same jobs, work the same, come home, go out, go dancing, go to a disco, maybe in a wheelchair, sit, turn around, the wheelchair. You still enjoy yourself, everybody's doing stuff.
Living a life like everybody else.
Yeah.
We talked about that a lot on the Skype.
We're the same as everybody here. You do everything, you go shopping, you go shopping, you go anywhere, you go on holidays. Like she's on the wheelchair, she goes anywhere she wants, don't you? See?
I thought it was
No, I shouldn't be saying that, but I'm just saying that. No, that anybody in the wheelchair, they should treat like everybody. We're all one family. help us out for this. Thanks very much for helping us out.
Yeah.
But yours, we would be here.
But we have to do one more thing
Yeah, well,
before
sorry.
we, because that was such a beautiful closing remarks, but
Here she is, look.
yeah, that's Denise. I think we have her on the other slide.
Lovely girl she
That's
is.
both of you having dinner together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I brought them there, and then we went to let the young club and the ring be coffee.
Post in a restaurant. What did she say?
She said, what are you doing? I'll show you something. Well, I had to sit, I couldn't get to sit on some slush. So she's with your pocket, I don't care with your pocket. Will marry love? Yes, thank you. She went to face went red red, we'll start that. We got free drink. Bottle of wine, she could drink wine, she got free several quid that bottle of wine.
So that went well, didn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, and we also decided, because you wanted to talk to Denise through this project too, right? That's why we had the idea to write a letter for her. I think you can't see it here, but if you
That's all right.
yeah, so we don't want to give away too much because the letter's going to be in the book, but what did you want to use the letter for? The letter
Just
to
to
Denise?
let everybody know that you can be everybody can be a couple. Doesn't matter if you're in a wheelchair, you're still a couple, you still get married. Or where you are, you still get married. Don't care if you can't walk up, you still get married. It's up to yourselves, not up to anybody else, or these TVs, they're all the shite they are. They should be helping us out with this, but they don't. So we have to fight them and tell them where to get off.
That actually fits to the second letter we wrote, and that was to society in general, right? And that's, I love how you said, just take me serious already. So what did you want to, what we actually just said that?
Just that takes all of us serious, because we're like everybody. You go walking, you do that, you walk. You should be treated the same as everybody here. Everybody here should be treated. Everybody here, outside, inside should be treated better. Doesn't matter if they're the same way, they should be treated. You shouldn't call them names because it's this few people there. Go and chat, talk. Don't say these, you're not talking to them. More just talk and say, hey, what's your name, yeah, you know? You don't fight you, just sit down and have a chat, talk. Jam something, help them out, they help you.
Sounds easy, it shouldn't be that hard, should it?
No.
And yet when we talked on Skype, I remember that there wasn't only the thing about the travelling, which was mainly your family saying you can't, but there were so many stories you told me where people didn't take you serious or didn't support you getting a job, getting married.
Well, she doesn't have yet to come down here, she got me to come down here before.
Yeah.
She's good.
That's when we met on the first workshop.
That's right, yeah. When she asked me to come down, I said, yeah.
Oh,
Think that right there? She asked me to come down and look me now, look.
there we are, yeah.
How you come back down here
This
again?
one. So yesterday when we did a little rehearsal, we were talking about that you were actually so happy to be here, sitting here, talking to people and for once not listening.
Yeah, people in the, all people the same. Talk, chat like we're doing now. Say, look, that's what you should do there. It comes with videos and said, oh, listen to them, listen what they have to say. Don't pour in, just listen what they have to say and then they finish and we'll have what they say.
But there's one special person you still, because we did 3 letters to show 3 people, and the third one is for your brother, right?
Right, yeah.
The letters to your brother, Damien, yeah. He's, so what did you...
He's a good brother, yes. He's a carpenter.
And what did you write in the letter to Damien? What was that, what you wanted to
Just
say?
that, help me to get on holidays. I know you help to get holidays. When you give help to holidays, you can start with friends together, but if you don't, then I'll just
Well, you want him to understand how important it is, right?
and listen what I have to say. Sit down and listen. Don't be talking too fast. Just sit down and talk and chat. And then talk and then you say, you're going to after Christmas to do this. Oh, we'll let me after Christmas to go on holiday. But I try to go on holiday with decent. If that happens, I just have to learn.
So you talked with your family before, but you felt like maybe this project is a way when we have a book to do it in a more profound way.
Let me sit down.
So the lady with the tie
Oh, sorry.
waved at us a couple of minutes ago. So I might switch, but is there anything else you want to say before I start with my response?
So just thanks for every people here asking to come down and Julianne, and the friend there, and you as well, and everybody there. Thanks for putting us all down, and hope to come back again. Please God.
Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much, Ronnie.
No. What do you think? That's it. I love it.
So, I don't want to interrupt. Oh, I do.
Go on.
Yeah. So we're already a bit running out of time, so I will try to do my response now and try to do it in such a profound way as you just told your story. It's going to be about the barriers you were facing, because it took me so long to understand why exactly you can't travel. I don't know why this keeps happening. Maybe I'll start my response with a little story too, because as a matter of fact, I just came back from holidays, and I was very excited to go on holidays, and the first day, actually, I lost my purse, and I lost my passport, and my money, my credit card, and my bank card, and it was really my fault, so that wasn't the best start. But everything went out well. I was able to continue, and that was because everybody was accommodating me and supporting me, and especially my bank. Actually, it hasn't been the first time such thing has happened. They were very helpful, and it just really made me think about your story and some parallels, and I will get back to that later. Because my point is not to travel with me, that's okay, but that there's double standards, and that nobody would ever forbid me to travel, even though my capacity to do so might be questioned. So when I started working, or when I got selected to do the Voices project, I was really happy, and I had this, the whole purpose is to look at your situation and the story from a human rights perspective. And I think I will just start with that, because I think your story about wanting to travel is all about choice and the way we want to live our lives, and the way society sometimes doesn't let us do what we want with our own life. So I just quickly want to highlight which provisions are of particularly importance in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we have the general principles, and they say that states are obligated to respect individual autonomy, and that includes the freedom to make one's own choices about one's own life. So there it is, and that's very obvious. And we've already been talking a lot about Article 12 today, and of course that applies too, even though it was, I'll get to that later, but so this calls for state parties to provide support, and I think to support to make your decisions, but also to exercise them and to make them into reality. And that's where your idea, I think you made the decision that you want to travel with your fiance, but yet I had no support to really actually do that and exercise that. So your legal capacity is restricted. And there's a general comment number 1 who also explicitly says that this goes for formal and informal substituted decision making. So it's not only for persons who by law have been restricted in their legal capacity, but also by persons who might be restricted in their own choices in an informal way, with no law actually legitimizing this. And that's actually the key thing which really surprised me initially when we started working on your story, that there was no law saying that you were not allowed to travel. So that's one important point. And another really important article is, I think, the 119, living independently and being included in the community, because it says that state parties need to recognize your right to live in the community, but also to have choices equal to everybody else. And I think you make that point very clear. And Eleanor already earlier said that the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, they publish general comments in order to give guidance to states about how to actually implement those provisions. And they just recently did so. The 5th general comment is on Article 19. And I think the reason behind is that also that states have a bit of a misunderstanding often on how what is actually in the scope of the right to independent living and to live and be included in the community. And one very important point is that it's not restricted to your place of residence. It doesn't just mean you have to live in the community, but it's just as much about personal choice. And I think that applies really well, because your wish to travel is really just an expression of your personal way of life and your lifestyle. That's what you want to do with your life. Yeah, and that's actually really addressed very well in the new comment, if you want to have a look. There's a link, which says that all these things, all these little choices, and it could be everyday life choices, which is maybe might not seem to have big impacts, but all of them together make out who we are as a person, and I think that's a crucial right for everyone. Right, so as I said, I was surprised first because I was looking for the law or the legal background where I could then identify and say, oh, this law needs to be changed, or even this paragraph, or this. And I soon found out that that really isn't the case in your story, because I checked if you had a wardship, like you're a ward of court, but you're not, so there is no legal background for telling you not to fly, really. You might have a problem in buying the tickets and booking hotels, but this is so much more about attitudinal barriers than about informal barriers, because what's holding you back isn't really the law. So
I have a passport.
yeah, do you have a passport?
Have you?
That's the first step, that would be a good one. So it's really not the formal things that are holding you back, but much more the informal ones. So yeah, that's what your story is really all about, I found. But, yeah, so what prevents you to travel? And it's different factors, and they all kind of are interlinked, and they kind of reinforce each other. So it was a bit of a, yeah, it's not that easy. But I think the first thing I found was that you had a lack of information. So nobody really told you that you are allowed to travel, and that's like a pretty important aspect to be able to travel, to know that you're actually allowed to. And there was different information, even when we Skyped, that you had no knowledge of too. So you didn't know about your legal status or about your financial status. And this really makes it hard for you to not only travel, but have your life decisions. And what really struck me too is a lack of resources and support. And we talked about the money situation and how hard it is to get a job and to get money to actually travel or live your life. But it's also the support to arrange things and to make your choices come into reality. And I think all of these aspects also are based on the attitudinal barriers. I think that's a key thing.
Your own choices.
Yeah.
No less.
But people are worried or are doubting that that would be a good idea, and I think that's what's a big problem here.
That's up to us, no less.
Yeah. And so I tried to find out with your family, because they're not your ward committee, they're not actually, the law doesn't tell them to tell you what to do, but still you are in a way in a dependent relationship on them, because they give you support and they give you money. And so I think the issue of dependency, even if it's informal, is a very key factor here too. And Eleanor and Anna After and Cares addressed this in a recent publication, I think, in the preparation of the Voices project actually, that if an individual perceives a great cost in exiting a particular relationship, they may be considered dependent on that relationship, regardless of whether their perception is accurate. So even if you're formally free to do what you want, the exit of his relationship with the family would just mean losing an emotional bond, obviously, but also losing support as a consequence. And it doesn't even matter if you want to leave that relationship, which I don't think you do, but the fact that you couldn't, even if you want to, plays a huge part in here. So this restricts your choices. So I think the key issue here is really the attitudinal barriers, as I said, and their impact. But there's not just the worries about your family and other support persons. I think that's one big factor that they're worried that something might happen when you travel. But it's also society in general. And then I would like to come back to my experience, my holiday experience, and this happening, because I think that's where the double standard is. I think if you would have had the same situation, losing your wallet and losing everything in holidays, I think you might have had a lot of a harder time to actually continue your holiday, to convince the bank to get your cards and everything. And I think that has to do with people doubting the capacity to travel and then not giving you the chance to try and to practice actually, and to actually give it a try. So that's a very big issue, but I think the doubts and worries that your family might have are also related to it's not only about maybe doubting if you can do it, but I think it's also probably about the experiences with society, because they know people don't react well, and they know people have a lot of prejudice against people. And as you said yourself, they know that you're not being taken seriously sometimes, and they worry that that might infringe it. So there's different factors at play and effect, but the overall, I think the overall basis is stigma and this deficit-orientated view of what people with learning disabilities can do and what they can't do. And yes, all this leads to actually the lack of recognition of the personal relevance, like taking your wish serious and seeing that it's just very important. And I think it's very relevant to you, first of all, because it's your passion for traveling, but also for you and your relationship. And that's how it gets us back to Denise and you, because you're worried, as you told me, that not traveling together might actually be really bad for the two of you. And I think people who should support you might not have considered this in the way they should have, because they just thought, oh no, I don't think this is a good idea, Ronnie should travel, and that's it. And nobody has taken the time and effort to actually say, let's give it a try, or let's think what kind of support might be needed to make this a reality. And even the fact that we're here today and that we're trying to use this as communicating this shows that there's no real support in your community right now who would help you out with that. So quickly, no, that was too quickly. What needs to change? So it sounds so much easier than it is actually. Of course, we need to dismantle or abolish those paternalistic attitudes that make everyone believe that you cannot travel. And we talked about that you might need support, but these beliefs actually hinder anyone to come up with a plan or to at least give you a chance to try to travel. And I think that's a very underlying issue, but it might also be the hardest to abolish. And I think projects like this actually might start, and having a conversation about this in an open manner might start. But I think that's something that will take a lot of years, but we're working on it.
We get there.
Yeah. And another part is the access to advocacy, because even if you would want to complain about your family restricting your wishes, you would need someone who would support you with that problem. And the lack of adequate support, that's something I would like to finish off, because I think we mentioned this before, that the support systems that people with disabilities often have, and I think your support systems too, you can only have them if you're restricted in your choice. So you need the support, but by taking it there, at the same time restricting your choices, and they tell you, no, we're going to do it this way, that we think is best for you. And it's not about seeing what's your choice and to take this as a start. So this needs to change, and I hope we make a start with it in this project. So thank you.
Thank you.